And it just dawned on me that what Nikole Hannah Jones is really saying, and the people like her, what they're really saying is that our country is open up to anybody, that illegals can come here and they don't have to be taken out. So that's what they're really saying.
Decades, Black history has been weaponized, all right, not to empower us, but to condition us. So again, tonight we're separating fact from fiction. Because if you control the narrative, you control the mindset. And too often we've been handed a version of history that keeps us angry instead of informed. So tonight we're going to debunk the idea, or talk about, I should say, was American policing built on slavery?
Who understands history? When I see ICE, I see slave patrols. Now, I never lived through the slave patrol period, but if you know the history of policing in this country, then you understand that they were born out of slave patrols.
Blacks in America are 3 times more likely than whites to be killed by police. Nikole Hannah Jones, creator of the 1619 Project, says what we're seeing now has a disturbing link to the past.
In certain parts of the country, modern policing has direct lineage to the slave patrols. The slave patrols deputized white Americans to stop, to question, to search any Black person who was walking about, to ensure that enslaved people were not escaping or going in places where they weren't supposed to be. I really think that it is difficult to reform an institution that in many ways is doing the exact function.
Ladies, let's dig into this and break up the fact versus fiction. Many on the left had talked about policing have originated from slave patrols.
So no, that's not correct. Policing was started long before, particularly over in England, Britain, the UK, if you will. Our models are largely based on them, with the first one being in Boston and I think New York around the same time, 1830 something, somewhere. That's number one. Number two, in listening to that clip again, because I listened to it again, and it just dawned on me that what Nikole Hannah Jones is really saying, and the people like her, what they're really saying is that our country is open up to anybody, that illegals can come here and they don't have to be taken out. So that's what they're really saying. And what they are trying to do is they're talking about the methods, if you will. They're trying to make a distinction. They're not doing a very good job of it. I had to kind of dig a little deeper and say, oh, for them, they're trying to say that the methods and the tactics that ICE is using, that's what reminds them of the slave patrols. However, again, if you want to say that, then what they have to really say is that our country is open to illegals no matter what, and we should just let them roam freely and help to destroy our country. Violent, non-violent, just come one, come all. That's what they're saying. I'll stop there and let's go around.
All right. Nikole, this has been something that the left has been pushing for quite some time. This was also used as a reason why they were pushing the defund the police. Policing is racist. It was started from slave patrols. So it's racist just from its start. What are your thoughts on this?
I hate to introduce facts into their fiction, but let's do that. So when we think about, and it ties kind of back to what we talked about last week, when you think 1866, the Relocation Act, after the Union had won, right? And the Native Americans that inhabited most of Oklahoma in that area were forced to give up their slaves. Those brown people were forced to give up the Black people that they enslaved. You want to talk slave patrols? Who do they think was helping round the slaves up? Other brown people. How do they think the slaves got here? Brown and Black people. So you can't race bait your way out of the facts. What they try to do is use the word slave patrol, and it's supposed to make you feel some kind of emotion and reach down and find your inner Black girl and shake her by her ankles and say, girl, why aren't you mad? Well, here's why I'm not mad. If I followed their train of thought, and that's going to take some mental gymnastics, but if I did follow their train of thought, and she's saying that ICE is like slave patrols, once again, she falls short of the facts. Slave patrols didn't read you any rights. They didn't ask you repeatedly to get out of the car. They didn't argue and grapple with you and wrestle you to the ground. They didn't allow you to spit on them, call them dirty names, talk about their mom, or hit them with any vehicles. They did not allow any of that. Slave patrols did what probably like police in New York City used to do in the late 70s, early 80s. They beat you into compliance. There was no conversation. They smacked you over the head with their billy club. They hit you with the whip. They put shackles on you, whether you were free or not. It was up to you then to prove that you're free. What ICE is doing is enforcing the law. Jasmine Crockett is a legislator. If you do not like the law, there's a way to change it. Contact people like Jasmine Crockett. She's a legislator. Make a bill. Write a bill and say, we don't like this. This is the way we want it to be. But instead, she's looking for votes. She's looking for votes, and she needs to motivate Black people in Texas, of all places, to feel something about these quote unquote slave patrols that she's not old enough to know. Who didn't know that? Because I guess she was born in 1865 too. But she's not smart enough to understand. It falls flat. It always has. And this is why they keep talking about it, but it's really not taking root. It really isn't. Can I just dare say this as a hot take? If modern day ICE did act like slave patrols, we wouldn't have any illegal migration in this country. They would pack it up and go right on back to where they came from.
Yeah. And so what I want to just say is, because I just want to reiterate what both of you said, policing didn't begin in the American South, because this is the narrative that they're pushing. Policing began in the American South, and that was with slave patrols. As you mentioned, Shelley, Boston established a night watch back in the early 1600s. Then New York followed, and then Philadelphia in the 1700s. This is what they were modeled after. The English called it watch and ward systems, community-based crime prevention, and basically they were focused on fire prevention, public disorder, theft, drunkenness, not slave enforcement. This is what the idea of policing, where it started from in the 1600s, not the South, American South. Okay. Now, there was something called slave patrols. Okay. They did exist in the South. They primarily existed, in southern states. They were enforced slave codes, and they prevented escapes and uprisings. All right. But there's nuance here, folks. They were rural militias, not professional urban police departments. And this is not where the idea of policing began. All right. And then after the Civil War, many of these slave patrols were disbanded.
Well, let's stay right there. The slave patrols, they were disbanded. And yes, they were by the Confederate slaves. They were slave states. They were there to keep slaves, even the ones who had been free when it turned into the Black codes. And then it progressed to KKK. Then it progressed to Jim Crow. All of these people were Democrats. Okay, they were the racists. They never say that. These were the same people who wanted to keep the slaves enslaved. The slave codes prevented or were built to keep slaves from escape. Slaves, if you tried to escape, they wanted to come and get your ass and bring you back to the plantation. Okay, that's basically what it was. They never say all of this. Okay, and then who helped to free them? Who helped to keep their freedom? They were called the Radical Republicans. You don't say. They were called the Radical Republicans. Why were they called radical? Because at that time in history, they were doing the opposite of what was commonplace in the South. So this is how words get used differently. Today, we call radicals most of the people on the left. Well, at that time, Republicans were considered radical because they largely did not support and did not want to keep slaves free. Hence, we had Abraham Lincoln with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. But no, that wasn't enough, because even after the slaves were free, here comes the Black codes. Here comes the KKK, Jim Crow, all up until the Civil Rights era. So at every point when the Republicans, whether they were called the Radical Republicans or just Republicans, at every point when they went to make free the slaves, who tried to keep the people enslaved? Don't say it. Don't say it. The Democrats, the hoods, all the people that still wanted to keep people like all of us, looking like all of us and others, hanging from a tree, if you will, certainly working in the damn cotton fields or the plantations. Every turn, when you look at our history, it's always the Democrats who want to keep us enslaved.
And I got one better for you. In every Black dominated community right now in America, Democrats control the police right now. They've controlled the police for 60 to 100 years, okay, without Republican opposition, all right, complete control. So when they talk about these police departments, many of them are run by Democrats, and not just Democrats, Black Democrats. In many of these cities across America, folks.
Absolutely.
So again, this is a narrative that we have come on here to debunk. It is something that they continue to push every day, all day, the Democrats, the left, about these slave patrols.
Yeah.
And so it's time to correct the record.
And one more thing I want to say, KJ, I'm sorry. Outside of the slave patrols, after the emancipation, outside of slave patrols, every law, if you will, again, that freed the slaves or that wanted to ensure that Black people or former slaves were free, the Freedmen's Bureau, every law, then you could argue that the Black codes, the slave codes, certainly KKK, Jim Crow, that went against the law. They were the lawless ones because the people were free. They still wanted to enslave you. So you could argue that they were the ones breaking the law.
Wait, say it again.
Because of the emancipation, that was the law of the land. Because then you had the Black codes, which really wanted to, I'm going to say, overturn, if you will, the emancipation, because they had the laws or the laws that subverted. They had the Black codes that subverted the law because they still wanted to keep Black people. They tried to find ways to enslave them, keep them locked up, whatever. You could argue that they were going against the law of the day at that time once the slaves were free. So they were still the lawless ones.
Right. And the same with Jim Crow, right? Jim Crow was going against the laws of the land.
Jim Crow was considered local legislation, right? So, we have federal law, we have state law, and then you can have local law. Your local laws and regulations are what kind of govern your community. And this is why it is so important for you to vote in every single election. Most people say, no, I just vote for the president. The president of the United States has the least impact on your life. But the person who sits on your county council is the person who determines when and where your child will go to school, what your property taxes look like, where you can live, how you can live, permits that you can build things and you can't build things. They control most of your life.
Absolutely.
And they're usually elected by a swing of 100 votes. I mean, it is ridiculous how people give up their power thinking that the top of the ticket is where the power is. It never is. The people you couldn't pick out of a lineup are the people who control how you live in this country.
And let me ask you, I want to just ask something really quick. And this may be kind of off topic, but when you talk about like Jim Crow, Black codes, these were all local laws that were put in place. But then we had the Civil Rights Act. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So those laws, federal laws, did they override then these local laws?
Yes. So that's my point I was going to make to Nikole. Thank you for saying that. My point is this: what we see in a more macro picture, we continue to see the fight, if you will, the struggle, using that word again, between states' rights and federal rights. You see that this is basically federalism, if you will, or anti-federalism, depending on which side you're on. This is what it is in action. You continue to see that states' rights, federal law, and who gets to decide. So, and that's a nutshell of what we see with people like Nikole Hannah-Jones and others on anti-ICE, defund police, states' rights, federal law. This is still a play out, if you will, of those ideas.
It's working here, KJ, in Maryland in a very real sense when we talk about the 287G controversy that's happening here. Again, I point out the difference between having police that are hired by elected people and sheriffs who are elected by the people. Two wholly different concepts. And you see sheriffs across Maryland saying, we appreciate that the governor signed, what he signed, but we're going to do what's right by our communities, flat out. So this is that tug of war. Again, your local people telling the state, cute, but we're going to do what we need to do to protect this community. So it is a tug of war between the people, again, very local, who have more control over your day-to-day life, and the state, who is saying, you'll do what I tell you to do. And the community say, and if we don't, what are you going to do? What precisely do you intend to do? And it's the same thing that happens with the states and the federal government. You see Minnesota telling Trump, we're not going to give up our Somalis, no matter how much money they steal from us. It's none of your business. And this is literally what they're saying to the president. Come and get your troops and get out of our state. This is our state. You don't belong here. Trump is saying, I am the president of all of this, and what I say goes. And so this is a tug of war. But it does show healthy democracy, because it shouldn't all follow, a happy get along kumbaya kind of moment. This is playing out very clearly all over this country, with people who are kind of on either side of the immigration debate. But it also shows you how some people who are elected feel the pressure of their small communities on their shoulders, versus people who are state electeds who only come to do town halls where they have to import people to clap for them.
Yeah, I asked that because, as we end Black History Month this week, there is a big tug of war within the conservative circles about the application of the civil rights legislation, which we were talking about, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, and also the civil rights movement. I was actually speaking to Logic actually yesterday from Just the Guys, and he makes the contention that we didn't need the civil rights movement, that these areas were areas that were already on their way. He actually said that these areas were areas that didn't need this, that they were in good standing. These areas, most people were living a good life that were Black. And so it made me kind of think, when we were talking about this, how in these areas, many of these areas, they had Jim Crow, they had Black codes. And so as conservatives, as constitutionalists, do we side on the idea of the federal government passing civil rights law, or do we side with local government?
I think I would say, honestly, in a nutshell, I guess I would say it depends. Again, there are states' rights, there are federal laws and regulations. And again, we're not going to ever have this tug of war, as you say, because that's the republic that we have. That's how our Constitution is set up. So in a lot of ways, it is healthy. Because we don't have a dictator, we don't have a king or a monarchy. We are a representative republic, and at every level of government, we get to have a say, whether it's individual votes or the people we vote in to represent us. So I don't want it to change necessarily. Can I just say that we didn't need the civil rights movement? I would never say that, because there is a place for, again, the Constitution as a whole, and is a place for the people individually and as a state, if you will, to demand that our national level upholds the Constitution. There's a place for that. So that's where I would land.
What about you, Nikole, there? Mm-hmm.
Here's where I am. And it may seem a little kind of pragmatic, but this is the truth. That federal law was great on paper, super on paper. But what we needed was enforcement, right? Mm-hmm. To this day, we still have enforcement of that law, and we need it. We need the Office of Civil Rights. The Office of Civil Rights is incredibly busy in 2026. And the reason why they are is because sometimes local governments run afoul of the law, state government run afoul of the law, and it gives you, the citizen, recourse against people who overstep that law. Now, there are some people who have no idea what their rights are, and so they get taken advantage of. But there are people who are wise enough to know that it doesn't feel right, it doesn't look right, I'm going to go ahead and talk to me, an attorney, maybe call this 1-800 number and see what my rights are and what I can do. So I believe that we needed that legislation in order to give us that body that was going to oversee the things that were happening that were egregious and in that part. But my big mama, my maternal grandmother, grew up in Cooney, Texas, and called herself moving to the city when she moved to Dallas. And for her, she will tell you desegregating schools was the worst thing that ever happened to Black people. Being forced to live like white people is horrible for Black people because we had a greater sense of community. People, yes, there were still people who were drunk. Yes, there were still men cheating on their wives and wives having babies with other men. We had all the same problems because there's nothing new under the sun, but our sense of community was much, much stronger. And we talked about that last week, about how that happens, how we feel kind of torn apart from our general community. But I do agree kind of with you and Logic. We needed it, and we probably could have done without so much of it.
Mm-hmm. All right. Very good point, though, Nikole, about the civil rights agencies and the way we can actually go to them to uphold the law. So very good point. Very good point. Indiana was a state that it was not a Jim Crow state. And so my question for you is, what role or impact do you believe the civil rights era had on Indiana? Because there's been some, contention here within the last couple of years about the Civil Rights Act and the era, I should say, on the conservative side. What role or impact do you believe it had in Indiana specifically?
Well, I think it had a huge impact. I would say that any state that had Black people had Jim Crow impact. So Indiana, it's supposedly a northern state. I'll give you an idea. My father, when he was a young man, about 29 years of age, bought a piece of ground for to build his house, and the neighbors in that house, in that neighborhood, which was an all-white neighborhood at the time, got together and collected money to buy him out. And my father didn't take the money. He built his house there, and we experienced racial epithets, a bombing at our house when I was 2 years old. This was in Indiana. Indiana was the home of the Klan, Elwood, Indiana. So just because it's north of the Mason-Dixon doesn't mean we didn't have that impact. The civil rights movement was profound in its necessity. We here believe in a limited government and the limited role of the federal government, but the reality is it took the federal government to break through the issue of civil rights because states wouldn't do right. And as a result of that, we've been dealing with the issue of the balance between the federal government and the state government ever since. The sensibilities that those of us on the screen share is that the federal government should not be so all encompassing and powerful. But we benefited from that federal government stepping in strongly and telling the state, back down, you will do this for these people, you will allow their freedom to prevail. So it's an interesting balance. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 really turned on the issue of protected class. And the protected class was established to protect Black people. And I don't think there's anybody who would say that wasn't the correct thing to do, but it had its problems. And so what's happened is the protected class, which was established to fix decades and centuries of racism that was profound, has morphed into a preference as opposed to a protection. And so now it's the preferred class. And now what we're seeing is the civil rights movement of the 1960s has been hijacked by the gay rights movement, the transgender movement, every other movement but Black people. And if you look at what has happened from the 1960s to the present, the plight of Black America has actually gone down in terms of living standards from the 1960s as a result of the welfare state. And the welfare state came up from the mid-60s to the 70s. So it's a very complicated process in terms of where are we today with civil rights and where we need to be going forward. From my standpoint, I believe it's time for us to eliminate the protected class. The protected class status didn't really do us any good. If blacks were undereducated in the 1960s, we're still falling behind that mark here in 2026. If we were economically challenged in the 1960s, we're still in the same spot. We may have increased, but there's still an income gap, an earnings gap, an education gap. All of these gaps still take place, notwithstanding this protected class status. Part of that is the protected class status eliminated incentives for a lot of folks. So let's do away with protected class. Let's go back to the market and let the market dictate how we operate, how we respond to racism, how we respond to ill treatment. And I think that will be a better course going forward. It'll hurt for a while, but I think you'll see a strengthening in our people when we go to a truly free system that says that you are free to succeed, you're free to fail. It's going to be all on your own initiative. And it's unfortunate that you may have started this way, started that way. That's the way it's going to have to be in order for us to break through and gain the amount of freedom that we're entitled to.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your wise words.
Just pray for me, curtishill.com. How's that?
All right. Absolutely. God bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you.